Hi, it's Adrian, and I thought I'd continue on our discussions of Alexander principles. Last time we discussed inhibition, and this time we're going to discuss directions and directing, which is often considered the flip side of the same coin, inhibition and direction. It's often said if you are inhibited, you are directed because you naturally want to be expansive. Now, directions fall into two camps or two ideas. One is a very generic, general idea of being directed in activity through your awareness and activity, to generally be expansive in your engagement in movement. And the other's more specific, which was a phrase that Alexander came up with to remind himself not to be pulling on his neck all the time as part of the startle reflex. And the phrase was to let your neck be free, to let your head go forward and up, to let your back lengthen and widen. And this was really a reminder for Alexander of what not to do. So the mistake people often make is to try to do those directions, to put their head forward and up. And actually, in his own book, Use of the Self, he did actually use the word put. It was early in his writings. I don't know if he really meant that. It does sound rather mechanical. He certainly moved on from it. But you want to be very careful not to put your head forward and up. It's not a doing. It's really a reminder of what not to do. The most important words in that phrase is let. Let the neck be free. To let. You don't have to do this. This is something that happens by default after millions of years of evolution. If you're well inhibited from an overreaction, we find ourselves in poise. But obviously, many of us have then found ourselves not to be in poise because we've overreacted and habituated a reaction to an environment that's very different to the one we've evolved for, and also through injury and other factors as well, of course. Now, I have slight misgivings about this phrase, to be honest. Now, when I first started taking Alexander lessons, many years ago, the phrase simply didn't work for me. And a phrase is only as useful as it is useful. And it wasn't useful for me. And the reason for that is I come from two generations of military family. And I was practically stood at attention all the time. I probably had my chest slightly puffed out. I was very up. I always looked like I had good posture. To a casual observer, I wouldn't say I had poise, but I had that military kind of bearing. I just picked it up from my father and my grandfather. And to tell me to have, encourage me for my head to be forward and up, it just kind of bought into my existing habits of being up. And actually, I was one of a small minority. I don't know what percentages, but I actually needed to collapse a bit. I needed to just come off that a bit. So it didn't work for me personally very well. In fact, it was kind of by the third year of my training. So an Alexander Technique training course is 3 years full time. And by the third year, I could make use of the phrase. I could make it a useful reminder by that time. But of course, by that time, I didn't really need it. So I have to admit, I don't use the phrase that much in my own teaching because of my own personal, experience with it. It's not to say it isn't useful at all. It's a very useful reminder for many people, but I've just found it for myself. There is another caveat I have as well about it, and I've come to a different way of thinking that I'm not alone in this either, it turns out. So one of the problems I have with the phrase is there's a couple actually. How does one just let the neck be free? It's not particularly tangible to tell someone, say, let your neck be free. And when you do say that to someone, the one thing it's most likely to encourage is introspection. And we don't move well by going inwards. You can't micromanage your muscles. We just don't operate that way. The brain isn't evolved to work that way with our movement patterns. So that's one problem I have with it. Because of the introspection, you're no longer engaged in your environment as well. And that's your whole reason to move. So one of the reasons I came up with my way of thinking of directing is actually inspired by Alexander, funnily enough. He wrote something along the lines, I'm going to have to copy and paste this into the description below the video, because I can't remember it off the top of my head. but it's something along the lines, nothing in my work will be found to be outside nature or will be seen to be found in nature. He was very much drawing on nature, that his work wasn't supposed to be a substitute for what goes on, some sort of overlay. He was expecting his work to nourish what was already there. And I just thought to myself, well, how would any other sentient species direct themselves in activity? How would a cat direct themselves in activity? They're not thinking in words. They're not thinking, let my neck be free, to let my head go forward. No. I mean, of course, there's the orientation issue. Most other animals aren't bipeds, and their direction of their spine is on the horizontal, while as the vertical. But that aside, they're still in movement. They still move well. They need to be directed in activity. I thought, how do they do that? Because clearly they move well, and they don't have to consciously going around with some sort of trick mental thing that they do. I thought, what is it they do? What is it they do? And I came to the conclusion, and this is very core to the way I think about the Alexander technique personally. What they do is they gauge themselves in their environment. And this is something I've discussed quite a few times in the past, that we go where our attention is. And their attention is out in their environment. The environment, the space around you, is your only reason to move. You don't move because you have arms and legs. I mean, a snake doesn't have arms and legs. It doesn't move because it has a very pliable spine to move. We all move. Every creature moves because there's space to move in. And then we've evolved particular mechanical means of doing that to best suit our environment, over millions and millions of years. And that came out due to a mental engagement with the environment. There's a mental engagement to want to move in an environment, and those that achieved the best movement for that environment passed on their genes. But still very much a mental engagement. So if your engagement is up and out in your environment, you will naturally find yourself better poised. It just happens. It couldn't be any other way. The musculature, the nervous system is going to reflect that engagement. And I wasn't the first person to come up with this idea. I came up with it independently, but actually there's a well-known teacher called David Gorman, who very much thinks this way as well. And I found out about this in retrospect through two people. One's a Facebook friend, hi Nick, and the other's my first ever Alexander teacher, Lynn Neal, who coincidentally still lives around the corner from me. And over the years we've still met up on many occasions and discussed things. And she told me, said, yeah, you think just like David Gorman. I was like, oh, I didn't know that. So I was beaten to it. I'm not an original, unfortunately, but I do very much agree and subscribe to that thinking that you don't need to try to do directions. It's a way of being. So if you become aware of your peripheral vision, that naturally takes you off your that tight focus of the mind, because peripheral vision isn't just the eyes seeing more. The eyes see everything anyway. It's just whether the brain's bothering to pay attention to it. So if you allow yourself tangibly, say, to be aware of your peripheral vision, you either are or you're not, and it's tangible, you can then engage in your environment. And it does change the way we move. I do think there's some, you could argue, asking yourself to let your neck be free over a long period of time. It's like a wish, a gentle wish. Slowly but surely, day in, day out, it sets up something for the nervous system, a desire of a way to be. And I guess that could prove of value over time. Like I said, it didn't particularly for me. And apparently, in Alexander's last years of teaching, he gave up on offering those directions to people. He didn't do it anymore. He didn't encourage his own students to use the phrase. He didn't use that phrase with his students. Partly, I think, because he knew whatever you verbalize to people, unfortunately, it gets filtered. And every single time, it encourages people to do something. They want to do the head forward and up. It creates what we call Alexandroids. I've had Alexander lessons. And I very much don't want to do that. And I think he realised by the end it was doing that with all, it's a useful phrase for himself to remind himself in the early days of what not to do. But it doesn't always work as a phrase when you offer it to someone else. It gets filtered. So that's kind of my take on inhibitions there. On directions there. So I hope you found that interesting, thought-provoking, and practical. That's the best way to direct yourself in activity is not to worry about your muscles and your skeleton and everything. It's actually just to be fully engaged in your environment with your reason to move. and then you're free to move in any way you wish. Looking for a lot more freedom, not so much worried about being right. If you'd like to find out anything more about the Alexander technique, I do offer online lessons, so do get in touch, and I shall see you next time. Okay, bye.